Hi, everyone. I'm Patricia Greenfield from the UCLA Department of Psychology. My presentation is titled Pandemic Culture, Adaptation to Survival Threat. I'm going to report two studies that took place in the United States, but I'm going to start my COVID research story in Nabanchauk, a Maya community in Chiapas, Mexico. And I will end with some preliminary cross-cultural findings. I started doing research in Nabanchauk in 1969. At that time, the community was isolated from the outside world. Material resources were very limited. Lifespans were short, infant mortality was high, and mortality was highly salient. To adapt to this dangerous environment with limited resources, there were elaborate death rituals. Death was a very salient part of life. Here's a photo of Day of the Dead in the community cemetery. This family has fed the soul of this woman's late father by putting lots of food on his grave. In this dangerous environment, people coped by growing their own food. This young girl is harvesting corn. They cope by weaving clothing for themselves and other family members. Children were expected to contribute to family maintenance. Here, teenage girls on the right are making tortillas for the extended family. They're working with an older family member on the left. Besides showing young people contributing to family subsistence, this slide shows family cooperation and intergenerational collaboration. All of these characteristics are features of a subsistence ecology. When I returned to this Maya community in 1991, after an absence of 21 years, I found the results of tremendous social change. The economy had shifted from subsistence agriculture to commerce. Material resources were therefore more plentiful, and behavior had shifted to adapt to the new ecology. Family members were more independent, less collectivistic, and less interdependent in their behavior. Their social networks had widened beyond the family and community. Subsistence activities like growing corn were greatly reduced, and some clothing was being purchased rather than being woven at home. Another adaptation to the new commercial environment was that the authority of the older generation, based on controlling agricultural land, their authority was greatly reduced. Observing adaptation to social change in Nabanchauk stimulated me to develop a theory of social change, cultural evolution, and human development. One tenet of the theory was that cultural and behavioral adaptation to social change is bidirectional. We were able to test this idea of bidirectionality in the United States. Going back to survey data from the 1970s, our research showed that in times of greater material resources, young people in the United States became more individualistic in their cultural values and more interested in becoming rich. In contrast, in times of economic retraction, like the Great Recession, they became more collectivistic in their values and less interested in becoming rich. but they became also more concerned about having enough money to satisfy basic needs. In times of economic retraction, their conservation values also became stronger. This theory development and research on the cultural and individual effects of social change in Nabanchuk and the United States provided a framework to understand shifts I began to observe locally during the pandemic. The pandemic became a natural experiment for the study of cultural evolution and its behavioral manifestations. The next two slides show the parallels between the subsistence way of life I first observed in Nabanchuk in 1969 and shifts in our society during the pandemic. As people began to die from COVID, death became more salient in our society. Here in a photo from the Los Angeles Times, a family is grieving over a coffin of someone who has died from COVID. Pictures of dead bodies and funerals became very common. Death became more a part of life here as it had been in Nabanchuk. As this started to happen, I began to personally experience and observe behavioral shifts going on locally, but pushing behavior in the direction of life in Nabanchuk and other subsistence village communities around the world. I started a vegetable garden for the very first time, something I had had absolutely no interest in before the pandemic. Here I am in my front yard harvesting lettuce during the pandemic. Like Maya Women Who Weave, I went back to our cultural form of weaving, that is knitting. During the pandemic, my granddaughter, who had never shown an interest in cooking, began baking bread for the family. Her bread making activities were usually in collaboration with a member of the older generation, her dad, here shown in a reflected image. All of the changes I was observing were predicted by my pre-existing theory of social change, cultural evolution, and human development. So I wondered whether these local, personal, and family changes could be more widespread. I suspected that these shifts were a universal response to increased mortality threat. So with my collaborators, I carried out studies about the effects of COVID on values, concerns, and behavior. Let me now say a bit about my theoretical framework and how it organizes behavioral predictions in the two studies I will talk about today. Here you can see that the theory of social change, cultural evolution, and human development has multiple levels. The levels which will form today's framework are ecology, cultural values, adult behavior, and child learning environment. The labels are the major concepts. The blue arrows show the links between the concepts. They also show relationships that are relevant to the two studies on the pandemic I'm going to present. Ecology is posited to be the major causal influence. Ecological concepts that are central to our COVID research are increased mortality and the focus on household as an isolated social unit. The vertical arrows show the primary direction of influence. The red oval encircles one pathway of influence. That is, ecology influences behavior. In other words, behavior is adapted to the ecological environment. Here is an alternative pathway of influence. The red oval circles the pathway from ecology to cultural values, which in turn influence adult behavior. In other words, cultural values are adapted to the ecological environment, and behavior expresses a particular set of cultural values. This set of cultural values are in turn expressed in the learning environment adults provide for children. Let me now apply these levels to social change in the pandemic, transforming informal observation into theory-based predictions about the pandemic's effects. The basic idea was that as the environment shifted in the direction of a subsistence ecology because of increased survival threat and narrowing of the social world, those shifts would elicit corresponding adaptations on all the levels in this chart. I start with the ecological level. In the pandemic, mortality increased, leading to the prediction that mortality would become more salient. Creating further ecological change, stay-at-home orders led to a smaller scale and more self-contained social world. We predicted that these ecological changes would produce shifts downstream on lower levels of this diagram: cultural values, adult behavior, and child learning environment. The theory predicted that values would become more collectivistic and that subsistence values, such as conserving scarce resources, would become stronger. The theory also predicted an increase in subsistence activities. It predicted that authority would come to be more accepted and that family members would become more interdependent. We also predicted that greater family interdependence would reverberate on the level of child learning environment, that parents would increase their expectations for children to contribute to family maintenance, the subsistence tasks of the home. To test these hypotheses and understand what changed in the pandemic, we did 2 empirical studies. Study 1 was a large-scale survey study in California and Rhode Island about a month after stay-at-home orders were given in each state. Study 2 was a national study of Google searches and social media comparing online behavior before the pandemic with behavior during the pandemic. The survey revealed people's subjective experience of shifts during the pandemic. In contrast, the study of Google searches and social media revealed behavioral shifts after stay-at-home started. You will see that the findings of the 2 studies reinforce and complement each other. Here is an outline of methods used in the survey study. The sample was about 1,000 participants in each of 2 states in the United States, California and Rhode Island. Included in this sample was a subsample of 249 parents with children between 7 and 18 years of age. children who were living at home. We asked respondents questions about their experience of shifts in life during the pandemic about a month after stay-at-home started in their respective states. The parent subsample answered specific questions about changes in parenting during the pandemic. Factor analysis was used to identify component items for 5 concepts: mortality salience, subsistence activities, subsistence values, family interdependence, and cultural tightness. Bootstrap t-tests were used to identify significant shifts in these areas. Structural equation modeling was then used to explore causal effects of mortality salience and number of days of stay-at-home reported by each participant. During COVID, mortality became more salient for people in both California and Rhode Island. As the upward red arrow indicates, people in both states reported thinking significantly more about their own and family members' death. They reported thinking more about concrete plans for when they die or when family members die. For example, making a will where they would like to be buried. It turned out that I was not alone in starting a vegetable garden. In both states, many people reported that they had started a new vegetable garden during the pandemic, as the upward arrow indicates. Here's a lady harvesting lettuce in her garden. Other subsistence activities also increased. In both states, people reported that they were cooking more. In both states, many people reported they had increased their home maintenance activities. As a whole, the reported increase in subsistence activities, growing vegetables, cooking, and home maintenance was statistically significant at the 0.001 level with a large effect size. Factor analysis revealed a group of items we labeled subsistence values. All of these are stronger values in a subsistence ecology than in a commercial ecology. This factor consisted of not wasting scarce resources, high importance of having enough money to satisfy basic needs for food and shelter, low importance of becoming rich, high appreciation of family, and high appreciation of elderly. As predicted on theoretical grounds, people in both states judged that this group of values had become significantly more important during the pandemic. Another variable identified in the factor analysis was the acceptability of government restricting respondents' movement and the movement of others. This is what Michelle Gelfand and colleagues call cultural tightness. Acceptability of government restriction increased significantly in both states. Factor analysis divided family interdependence into 3 sets of items: family activities, respondent providing help to family, and respondent receiving help from family. Family activities consisted of eating and talking together. Help was both practical and social. As predicted on theoretical grounds, respondents in both states judged all 3 types of family interdependence to have increased significantly during the pandemic. These are the shifts, but what about contextual or ecological influences? A structural equation model shown in the next slide addressed this question. This slide shows the significant relationships identified in the structural equation model. Two variables representing ecological factors predict all the other shifts experienced during the pandemic. We see increased mortality salience as a reflection of the actual increased mortality produced by COVID-19. The red lines in the slide show that the experience of increased mortality salience predicts all the other shifts experienced during the pandemic. We see number of days of stay at home as a measure of the narrowing of the social world to the family household. The black lines show that number of days of stay at home predicts almost all the same shifts predicted by mortality salience. However, there's one more form of family interdependence. It was addressed in the subsample of parents with children living at home. Our parent subsample showed that during the pandemic, parents expected more help from their children at home. In both states, many parents reported increased expectations that their children would help with cooking for the family, cleaning common areas in the family home, and helping with family laundry. This was another form of family interdependence that increased during the pandemic. Parents shifted the learning environment of their children towards helping with subsistence tasks at home rather than being exclusively school-focused. Now on to study 2. For study 2, we did a national study of online behavior, Google searches, and social media. Whereas study 1 focused on people's subjective experience of change in response to survey questions, this study compared actual behavior before the pandemic with actual behavior during the pandemic. Using the big data search tool TalkWalker, we studied spontaneous online behavior in Google searches, Twitter, blogs, and internet forums. We assessed the frequency of specific terms posted on the internet during 70 days before President Trump's emergency COVID-19 declaration, and we compared those frequencies with the frequencies of the same terms posted during the 70 days after President Trump's emergency declaration. This is truly big data. Our data set consists of more than 500 million data points. The reports of people's experiences in the survey were confirmed by their spontaneous behavior online. In Google searches and social media, mentions of the terms survive, cemetery, fear of death, death, and bury shot up during the 70 days after Trump's emergency declaration. For example, the phrase fear of death increased by 115% on Twitter. On social media, the increase in mortality salience terms increased significantly across Twitter, blogs, and internet forums, with a large effect size on all 3 platforms. Significance level is so great that there's only a chance of 1 in 1 billion that this rise in mortality salience happened by chance. The reported increase in subsistence activities during COVID in the survey study was also reinforced by spontaneous behavior online. These shifts towards more subsistence activities in the areas of gardening, food preparation, and home improvement were as predicted by my theory. Reported increase in interdependent behavior and appreciation of family found in the survey study was reinforced and supported on the level of cultural values by a large increase in collectivistic words during the pandemic. The frequency of the collectivistic group of words share, help, give, and sacrifice significantly increased across all three platforms with a large effect size. To what extent do these findings represent universal reactions to COVID mortality and lockdown? We've preliminary data from social media in Indonesia, Japan, and Mexico. Our preliminary analysis indicates that significant increases in collectivistic words and words referring to subsistence activities occurred on Twitter in all three countries once that country went into emergency mode during the pandemic. However, in the two countries, Mexico and Japan, in which mortality was already culturally salient by virtue of important religious practices, words denoting mortality salience did not increase once the pandemic started. Thus, cultural shifts seem to depend on the extent to which COVID creates conditions in a particular country that were radically different from the pre-COVID state of affairs. Stay tuned for complete studies. In summary, all of the predictions concerning shifts in mortality salience, cultural values, adult behavior, and child learning environment were confirmed by the data, with the two studies providing complementary data both methodologically and substantively. Moreover, the overall hypothesis generated by my theory of social change, cultural evolution, and human development was strongly confirmed. As mortality increased in the pandemic and the social world shrunk to the household for many people, not only did the ecology move closer to that characteristic of subsistence villages, but cultural values, behavior, and child learning environments moved to adapt to these conditions. Collectivistic and subsistence values grew stronger. Subsistence activities became significantly more frequent. Authoritarian restrictions became more acceptable. Family members became more interdependent, and parents increased their expectations for children to contribute to family maintenance. In all these ways, increased mortality and shrinking of the social world brought about by the pandemic moved concerns, values, and behavior closer to a pattern characterizing an earlier, more dangerous time in human history. In conclusion, I've shown you the silver lining of the COVID tragedy. Will these changes last? I do not think so. The behavioral and value shifts I've shown you in the United States are basically adaptations to conditions that made mortality very salient and reduced people's social worlds to the family household. These adaptations happened very quickly when the pandemic started. As conditions change back to how they were before, as COVID mortality rates decline and people expand their social world back to its pre-COVID size, values and behavior will adapt by going back also. However, research suggests that there may be some sensitive developmental periods for cultural learning between about 9 years of age and early adulthood. So those who have gone through the pandemic in that age range may, in years to come, show traces of the values and behaviors that emerged during the pandemic, even when conditions change. As mortality salience wanes and the social world expands, the rest of the population will probably change back to our pre-pandemic values, activities, and concerns. And now let me conclude with my thank yous. This slide acknowledges all the people who participated in different ways in this research. In addition, I would like to express my thanks to the International Academy for Intercultural Research and to our audience. I hope this research helps you to make sense out of your own experience during the pandemic.